Politicians and Professional series, where this year we're hearing from the leaders of each of Scotland's main political parties on Scotland After Brexit. I'd like to thank all of our sponsoring organisations this week in the order of the logos. Oh no, I shouldn't have said that. The Faculty of Advocates, the Law Society, the Royal Society of Edinburgh, the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries, and the Young Academy of Scotland. And I'd particularly like to thank Vice President-elect of the Law Society, John Mulholland, for chairing the proceedings this evening. We'd also like to thank some other people at those organisations: Tim Mounser at the Law Society, Andrew Tregonning at the Faculty of Advocates, Tess Joyce at the Faculty of Actuaries, Morven Chisholm at the Young Academy of Scotland, and Julie Steele and Graham Herbert at the Royal Society for Edinburgh. We couldn't do this without them. So the order of business will be roughly as follows. Ruth Davidson, MSP, will speak for something around 40 minutes. The chair will then moderate an audience Q&A, which will start with a question from the Young Academy. Following the Q&A, Sir John Elvidge, our Chair of Trustees, will propose a brief vote of thanks. Then James Blake, a Fellow of the Young Academy, will take a couple of minutes to speak about their work. In return for lending him your ears, the Young Academy will then provide you with a drink in the lobby, which we'll aim to have in your hand by 7:35 at the latest. So all that remains is for me to ask you to please turn off your mobile phones and join me in welcoming the Leader of the Scottish Conservatives, Ruth Davidson.
Thank you very much. Good evening. Firstly, can I thank the Royal Society of Edinburgh for hosting us this evening, and let me also thank the David Hume Institute for once again setting up this series of lectures to kick off the 2018 political year here in Scotland. It is particularly good to see you in such good health with new management under Jane Frances Kelly. I read that Jane Frances came back to Scotland from an 11-year stay in Australia to take over the reins at the Institute last year, and after all the talk of Remainers and Leavers in a Brexit debate, it's nice to have a returner that's in our midst. The referendum is, of course, going to continue to dominate our public debate here in Scotland, and will do so across the whole of the UK in the coming months. There may be a few moments where domestic policy matters get a hearing, but the great gong of Brexit is more likely than not to drown them out. So I very much welcome the title of this lecture series, Scotland After Brexit, because it reminds us that, thank goodness, there may be a moment at some point in the not too distant future when Brexit negotiations will no longer be the only show in town, when we aren't forced to get an opinion on the latest sticking point coming out of some corridor in Brussels, at a time where, dare I say it, we will no longer have to watch Jacob Rees-Mogg or Andrew Adonis issue yet more dire warnings about the perils either of selling out or of leaving at all. A moment perhaps further away than most of us would like, when we will be able to focus on something other than the Brexit process. Because process is, of course, something we're very good at talking about in Scotland. But I'd like to use the opportunity of the lecture title this evening to try and focus on what we actually should do in Scotland after Brexit happens in March of next year. And I say try deliberately. As we sit here this evening, clearly it's still too early to be definitive about the future. As a former journalist who's covered the tortuous processes of EU negotiations in the past, my prediction is that we'll still have to wait some months yet before something clearer emerges. Meanwhile, in Scotland, it's also fair to say that we're yet to reach agreement on how the powers that are returned to the UK after Brexit are distributed to the nations and regions of this country, though I hope that that is something we can be clearer about sooner rather than later. And despite this clouded picture, I still see no reason for us not to set out a broad strategy for approaching the aftermath of Brexit. Indeed, I think it's vital that we endeavour to do so. So tonight, let me focus on two broad areas of particular importance. Firstly, I'd like to talk about some of the new policy choices that we'll likely have as a result of Brexit, and how I believe we should progress once they're here. And secondly, I'd like to talk about what I believe is the biggest challenge of all that's facing us here in Scotland after Brexit, and that's how we deliver economic growth as a country outside of the EU. According to the Scottish Fiscal Commission, we're set to endure a less than 1% growth rate per year until 2021. Or put another way, Scotland is currently staring down the barrel of the longest period of low growth for more than 6 decades. That has huge consequences for our finances, for every public service that we use, and for the quality of our lives. And I believe it is vital that we start the debate now on how we prove the economists wrong and show that Scotland can have a prosperous future. So firstly, on the Brexit choices that we face, and to a question that we don't hear an awful lot being asked at the moment. What should the UK do differently once we leave the European Union next year? As you'll all be familiar with, the Prime Minister has set out our own negotiating position of the kind of Brexit that she wants to deliver outside the single market and the customs union. But with all current EU rules and regulations being transferred into UK law, we'll start off where we are right now, aligned with the EU 27, thereby paving the way for what I hope will be a deep and lasting trade agreement with the EU in both goods and services. Now, naturally, most of all of the debate focuses on the rights and wrongs of this arrangement and how and whether it will be delivered. And I'm more than happy to take questions on this tonight. But so far, remarkably little time has been spent on what we do after Brexit happens with the new menu of policy options that are open to us. Brexit is happening. So from whatever side of the argument you're on, it's clear we need to start talking about what we want to do with those new options. One of the biggest issues of all is immigration. If we take that one for a second, freedom of movement from the European Union will end following the Brexit vote. But it doesn't follow that, as some might have it, immigration is going to end. What Brexit means is simply that the UK will design its own immigration rules for people coming into the country from the European Union. How we decide to exercise those competences is a debate that we now need to have. I've made the argument before, and I do so again, that especially at a time of near full employment, we must not just be open to people coming to this country, but we must attract them too. I agree with the Home Secretary that the UK needs to remain a hub for international talent and that we must be a bright prospect for the brightest and best from around the world. And the point is, this will be a choice for the government of the day. Brexit sets the platform, but it will be for government to decide what then to do off the back of it. And this fundamental point holds true for numerous other issues too, including key areas for us here in Scotland. What has struck me over the last few months is how little time and space has been devoted to debating the choices open to us, and I believe it's absolutely vital that we start to do so. So let me just mention 3 specific areas that I think are particularly relevant to us here in Scotland. Firstly, agriculture. When we leave the European Union, we leave the Common Agricultural Policy. After Brexit, we will therefore have to design a new system of support for farmers, something of massive import to people here and to the economy here in Scotland. Yet there has barely been a debate about what this should look like. In the Scottish Conservatives, we're thinking our own way through this right now. One thing even Remainers like me can agree on is that the Common Agricultural Policy, which has to weigh Greek olive farmers against Welsh sheep farmers, is always going to struggle to be tailored to an individual country's needs. Now, I do not seek to diminish the complications that arise from setting up a replacement, but we believe that there is an opportunity here to design and implement a new system of support for farmers which works better for their needs. We need a system that protects our farmers' access to the UK internal market. We don't need, for example, different regulations on fertiliser or animal health, if we take a couple of examples, but we can use this chance to simplify administration in Scotland so we can be spared the repeat of the IT fiasco we've seen in recent years. And we also need a system that takes into account our specific needs. The vast majority of land in Scotland is classed as less favoured area. That's the status it enjoys. That's in contrast, for example, to England, where that is around 15%. So we will be pushing for a system in Scotland that really targets support for low-income farmers in some of our most remote communities, support which in many cases helps to ensure that rural communities in Scotland can continue to thrive and can retain young people living there. Now, at the same time, We want to ensure that a new support system boosts Scotland's already enviable reputation for high-quality food production and our growing food and drink export market, and one that absolutely reinforces our reputation for environmental sustainability. And that leads me on to the second area, where I think we need to lend more thought to, and that is the wider question of the environment. Again, a huge number of powers on environmental standards and regulations are currently exercised at an EU level, and they're going to come back to the United Kingdom. So how do we want to change? Now, I know that there's been fears that Brexit will mean our environmental standards will drop, that in a rush to sign a trade deal with every Tom, Dick and Donald, we'll all be eating chlorinating chicken or turning rivers into sewers or opting for low regulation, low standards for a low economy. But again, I reject that as any sort of inevitability out of Brexit. How we choose to regulate our environment is a matter of exactly that. It is a matter of choice. And my choice is similar to those choices that are currently being put forward by the Secretary of State, Michael Gove, to show that after Brexit, we should seek to improve Scotland and Britain's environmental record, not squander it. In short, we should think of the current EU regulations on the environment as the floor, not as the ceiling for our own new system. And in Scotland, I'd like to see us be really ambitious. To give one example, one idea that the Scottish Conservatives are considering is to improve the current system of environmental rights by setting up a new environmental court here in Scotland to hear cases for people who feel their right has been infringed. There is no reason why this can't be done now. But Brexit does provide a moment when we can make these changes to ensure that power is held closer to people in Scotland and in the UK. Right now, environmental justice in Scotland is utterly inefficient, with some cases heard in courts, some by ministers, and others in the Court of Session. So creating a new environmental court would allow the judiciary to develop an expertise in environmental law and science, helping to ensure that people can get redress where it's right to do so. They may choose to act over the state of our marine environment. And this brings me neatly onto a third area. That's the area of fisheries. And again, despite supporting Remain, I've always been clear that Brexit will allow us to design a better fisheries policy for Scotland. Our choice should not be to erect a false border around our seas, barring foreign vessels from entering our waters. But it should be to design a world-class management system that delivers the maximum possible sustainable yield for UK fishermen, while also protecting the marine environment and encouraging species growth. And another thing, this management system will need to be overseen from the UK and not from Brussels as at present. So another idea the Scottish Conservatives are proposing is that the UK government bases more of its civil service infrastructure governing fisheries here in Scotland. Now, I've very briefly just picked up on 3 specific areas of agriculture, of fisheries and of the environment, but I could have picked out many more. And the point in raising them is to highlight how many choices that we have that we are going to be compelled to make coming down the tracks. And I think we need to start quickly with debating how we're going to get on with delivering on those choices. And if there's one plea that I would make this evening, it's to encourage both the UK and Scottish governments to step up their dialogue on how we make this work. One that puts practical politics before ideology and seeks to try to make things work as best they can. For example, if we go back onto that issue of the environment, I mentioned that we could have a new environmental court here in Scotland to hear cases that apply. Now, equally, it's clear to me that there are plenty of environmental powers that are held by Brussels that should come back straight to Scotland, for example, over forestry. But at the same time, it will be in our interest to ensure that we maintain the integrity of a UK-wide internal market. It is not in our interest to have different regulations on animal health, for example, because it would only make it harder for Scottish meat to be sold elsewhere in the UK. And similarly with food labelling. A Dumfriesshire chicken farmer wants to be able to sell breast meat in the Carlisle Tesco as well as the Kirkcudbright one without 2 different regimes. Far better to see cooperation across the UK so that the EU-wide standards we currently abide by are built on across Britain. The natural world doesn't recognise borders. Scottish fish do not turn back in the sea at Berwick. So let's work together on this as we go forward. As Sean Spears, the chair of the Green Alliance, says on Life After Brexit, Scotland is and will continue to be an environmental leader. But our environment, the world in which we live, is more important than any political differences between the Scottish and UK governments. I therefore urge both parties to work closely together to devise the best possible system of environmental protection as we leave the EU. So broadly, I find myself in agreement with the former Labour Scotland Office Minister, Brian Wilson. Writing in the Scotsman last week, Brian declared, "There are real risks to Brexit, which is why, on balance, I voted Remain. But sensible people can also see opportunities to do things better, which are actually quite exciting if that is how events develop." I'm afraid that too many Remainers, and I include the SNP in this, too often project their own political motives onto Brexit. For them, it can't be, as David Cameron put it last week, that Brexit is a mere mistake. There is a political imperative that it must be a calamity. Now, I don't seek to downplay the risks involved in Brexit at all. But while acknowledging the dangers inherent in such enormous change, I believe that it is important that policy leaders examine the horizon for areas where there may be opportunities too. Once we're out of the EU, for example, it's possible that more public procurement could be done locally, supporting local suppliers here in Scotland. As a member of the UK internal market, it might be that Scottish firms will be able to benefit more from UK-wide supply chains, where, let's remember, more than 60% of our trade is done. And that's why, ladies and gentlemen, the Scottish Conservatives are keen to ensure agreement between the UK and Scottish governments on the withdrawal bill that's currently heading for the House of Lords. Getting shared frameworks in place so that we can start dealing with the very real practical issues that will come after Brexit and which require our urgent attention. And in dealing with these practical concerns, it allows us also to get on with life. Scotland has been on pause for far too long. Almost my entire career in Parliament has been taken up either with political campaigns or questions of constitutional process. And I think we need to do so much more. We need to start focusing on the biggest challenge we face of all. And I don't think that's Brexit, but by finding a path to real and sustainable economic growth, because nothing else comes close. So let me devote the rest of this evening's lecture onto this. How, after Brexit, do we get Scotland growing? As I mentioned at the start of this lecture, those growth prospects at the moment are nothing short of dire. In December, the Scottish Fiscal Commission predicted a growth rate of less than 1% until 2021. To put that in some context, research has found that this is literally the lowest projected growth rate in the developed world. It is lower than every other OECD, G20 and EU nation. If this does indeed play out, the impact on all of us will be enormous. To give a flavour, after the Fiscal Commission revised February's projected growth rates down in December, it reduced our expected income receipts over the next 4 years by fully £2 billion. And I would suggest, to put it mildly, that Brexit or no Brexit, hard or soft, we need to act with some urgency, because increasing prosperity is the single most effective way of improving people's lives. And central to the question of how we do that is to do something to boost productivity, the contribution that people make per hour worked to the economic engine of our country. Now, I should make it clear that this isn't a Scottish-specific issue. Low productivity is a problem that afflicts the entire UK. To illustrate, for every hour worked, Americans generate about 28% more income than Britons, and Germans 35% more. But our low productivity rate impacts us in Scotland at least as much as it does anywhere else in the UK. It is costing us in lower GDP growth, in low wage growth, in low income tax receipts, and therefore in less money for public services. So we need to turn this around. In the Scottish Conservatives, we've recently convened a new economic commission led by the former Scotland Office Minister, Lord Dunlop, to look at this very issue. Our intention is to have a properly researched set of policies ready for the next Holyrood election, so that, if we're fortunate enough to form the government, we can prioritise this issue immediately. And while the group has only begun its thinking on this, it's fair to say that we're already focusing on some specific areas under the Scottish Government's control, which we think can be improved, so that those growth forecasts I mentioned can be proved entirely wrong. So let me run through just a few of them this evening. Firstly, in research and innovation. I was lucky enough to host a dinner last Friday evening for Bill Gates during his visit to Edinburgh. He came here to invest £28 million into Edinburgh University's Easterbush campus to support cutting-edge research into developing GM crops for use in developing nation. It is an investment which I hope will see research made here in Scotland impact on millions of people in some of the poorest parts of the world. Not just to feed the hungry, but to lift people out of absolute poverty, to increase economic independence, and to boost the growth of developing nations. And it points to one of our great Scottish strengths, the enormous intellectual capital stored in our universities and our world-class research units. We have more PhDs than you can shake a stick at in Scotland, and we easily outperform key areas and regions of the UK. But where we sometimes fail is in igniting that intellectual fuel so that it drives the Scottish economy forward. We have to do better at incubating this capital and turning world-class research into the products and industries of tomorrow. And some pretty challenging questions need to be asked of our current economic development effort. Each year we spend over £500 million on skills, enterprise support and innovation. The enterprise agencies alone spend £700,000 every single day. And in Scotland, the amount we spend on economic development per head is more than double of that across the UK as a whole. Yet we have the lowest rate of business growth in the UK. Why? It's not as if we don't have enough enterprise agencies and business gateways and civil servants all tasked with supporting startups and entrepreneurs. But simply put, it's because in Scotland we don't have the right economic strategy to stitch it all together. We are not maximising the work that is going on in research departments across Scotland for the benefit of all. That is something we intend to address with proposals over the coming year. And secondly, if we're going to boost economic growth, we need to look again at education and skills. Constantly, we are being told by businesses that our education and skills system is not aligned with the needs of industry, that by putting higher education on a pedestal, we've allowed further education and technical education to fall by the wayside. Why is it that fantastic organisations like Code Clan, which teaches students coding skills, is still very much the exception and not the rule in Scotland? Equally, why is it that places like Jim McCall's Newlands Junior College in Glasgow, where school-age pupils are given skills and training suited to their needs, that are growing despite and in conflict with, not because of, the current system? So I believe it's time to look again at the arrangements for post-16 education in this country, to champion technical education and to rebalance the further and higher education sectors. And it's something that we intend to talk much more about in the coming weeks. And thirdly, we need to look at infrastructure. Can we really grow as a nation when, as happens right now, any attempt to plan and build new housing and infrastructure is bogged down for unnecessarily long periods in planning? That's why we're calling for a new housing and infrastructure agency in Edinburgh to support local authorities in pushing ahead with new development. And as we now have at a UK level, a housing minister in the Scottish Cabinet. Can we really grow as a nation when, as happens right now, large parts of the country are still denied superfast broadband? We must see speedier action from the Scottish Government to ensure that superfast broadband is available to all firms in the country. So infrastructure, both physical and digital, is going to be vital in improving our country's productivity. Capital spending is now rising fast in Scotland, so I very much hope that the SNP government can get on with delivery. So infrastructure, education and skills, research and innovation, 3 vital areas where Scotland needs to do far better if we are to solve the productivity puzzle. But let me lastly focus on a final issue, one particularly current this week, and that is the question of tax. The SNP's government's budget is back in the Scottish Parliament tomorrow. And really the only question hanging over it is how much exactly will Scotland be paying more? And I think I've made our views pretty clear on the matter in recent weeks. Tax rises may mean short-term revenue, but I remain deeply concerned about the trajectory that we're taking as a nation. Business rates are already higher for large firms here than they are elsewhere in the UK. The tax on buying a home has also gone up. Now, if this budget is passed, we know that income tax rates for anyone earning over 33,000 will rise too. We've got to ask ourselves, what will be the impact of this? We will, I suspect, soon see firms offering to pay a Scottish surcharge for staff paying more tax here than they would elsewhere in the UK. And that presents a question as to whether those firms will prefer Edinburgh and Glasgow to Manchester or Liverpool as places in which to invest and settle. As Liz Cameron of the Scottish Chambers of Commerce has put it, if Scottish businesses are taxed more and Scottish-based staff are taxed more, then that would not seem to be a situation designed to attract investment and grow Scotland's economy. Or as Tom Hunter has said, the perception, if you're a talented person sitting in London, Manchester or Birmingham, and Scotland wants to attract you, is that you may think that Scotland is a high-tax economy. And I fear that he may be right. As the First Minister has herself acknowledged, income tax powers in Scotland are not a toy. Decisions on tax have consequences, often unintended, which can have a huge real-world impact on a nation's economic health. The Scottish Government needs to be watchful that we don't, in Scotland, put off investment thanks to our tax policy, which in the end will only reduce the total tax take, cutting the amount of money that we have available for our vital public services. Better, in our view, to focus on increasing the tax take with policies focused on growing the economy, because the millions the SNP say will be brought in by raising taxes, and that is assuming no big behavioural changes, are utterly dwarfed by the £2 billion downgrade in the growth forecast unveiled in their same draft budget. So to sum it up, ladies and gentlemen, while it may not seem like it, especially this week, there will be life after Brexit. While the Westminster soap opera drags on, that is not an excuse for inaction here in Scotland. And it will not do to simply blame Brexit for everything. As the Fraser-Ballancer Institute has noted, with any Brexit uncertainty affecting the UK as well, it is hard to argue that Scotland's relatively weaker performance can be explained by the outcome of the EU referendum. With Brexit comes new choices, and we must start actively preparing the ground to take advantage of those choices where we can. And more importantly, with the huge powers at the Scottish Government's disposal, we must capitalise on Scotland's strength in research and innovation to deliver lasting economic growth. We must look to ourselves, and if all we hear from Scottish ministers here is a counsel of despair, we will miss those opportunities which are in our grasp. We must ask how we can contribute, not recriminate. So let me end on a slightly more optimistic note. I agree that Scotland after Brexit faces huge challenges. There's a reason that I fought on the Remain side. This evening I've mentioned two of those challenges: the fallout from our departure from the EU and our low economic growth. To these I could add the challenge of social isolation, the challenge of industrial automation, or across the world the surge in populist nationalism or the continuation of mass global migration. Certainly, we do not have our problems to seek. But let us remember that defiantly, progress has an uncanny habit of winning through. Next week, to take one example, we mark a quiet but very significant anniversary. On February the 5th, the Berlin Wall will have been down for longer than it was up. For those of us who can remember a time when half of Europe was under the yoke of communism, it is a remarkable thought. Once seen as a threat to our way of life, now that era of a divided Europe is the stuff of history. So at the risk of sounding Panglossian, here's an alternative view of the coming years ahead. One in which intergenerational unemployment continues to fall, with fewer and fewer children growing up in workless households, in which global poverty also continues to fall, cutting infant mortality and boosting the chances of education for girls around the world, where, as nations develop, they prioritise clean air and water, ensuring that the environment is considered as part of economic advance, where policymakers, where journalists, where qualified authorities begin to properly challenge the lazy and the mendacious online, restoring faith in the body politic, and where a more activist generation emerges, willing and able to use new technologies to band together with like-minded people across the globe in order to change the world for the better. Walls may get built, but they do have a habit of being torn down. And while challenges may come our way, history shows that we find a way to overcome them. Idealistic or not, faced with the choice of focusing myopically on the undoubted challenges that Brexit will bring, or on taking a broader and more uplifting view of the advances that can be achieved over the years to come, I emphatically choose the latter. For many of us, the circumstances we find ourselves in are not of our choosing. But as David Hume reminds us, he is happy whom circumstances suit his temper, but he is more excellent who suits his temper to any circumstance. In the months and years ahead, as Brexit unfolds and as the challenges and opportunities of these new conditions present themselves, all of us in public life would do well to remember those words and to adjust our temper to those new circumstances and to put our shoulder to the wheel. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. Can I just check, can everyone hear me? Okay. We're now going to have a question and answer session. I don't expect there'll be very many questions. Brexit's not that controversial, is it? But I know we do have at least one question. But before we do that, everyone, if you are going to ask a question, could I just ask you please to give your name and the organisation that you're from? And what we'll do is take perhaps 2 questions at a time and then ask Ruth to answer them if that's... Okay.
Excuse me.
So the first question we have is from Professor Aileen Wall from Scotland's Rural College. Professor Wall.
Thanks, John, and thanks, Ruth, for that insightful talk. As has been said, my name's Aileen Wall, and I'm a member of the Young Academy, as well as working for Scotland's Rural College. And you'll hear a bit more about that after the Q&A session. You've highlighted that there's a lot of decisions to be made and new policies to be reinvented here. So I was wondering, what's the best way for YAS and its members to help influence and inform that policy and decision making to make sure that we're affecting a good outcome for Scotland?
Sure. Well, I think that the Young Academy has always had a strong history on drawing on the experiences of its members. In my experience and in my time in politics, it's always been very good at knocking on the doors it needs to knock on in order to make those views known. But I think in terms of how we go forward with Brexit, and particularly in a Scottish context, it kind of needs to be organised on a sectoral basis. I think that the way in which we're looking at deals being structured post the transition period, it will be a sector-by-sector set of arrangements and discussions and negotiations. So with your members, I would encourage them to, as they're debating and publishing the issues that are of import to them, and as they're speaking to ministers, both north and south of the border on that they would be disciplined in the way in which they go about it, would be my advice.
Okay, thank you. Okay. At the back, it's second. Yep.
Thank you. Jules Adam from Young European Women UK. You were talking about the prospect of Scotland after 2019, but I would like to point attention to the shorter perspective. It still seems like within the Conservative Party there is difference in opinion on how to go about Brexit. And against that backdrop, I was wondering, do you think a new referendum would be a good occasion to put the disagreement to rest? And I guess, bearing in mind the recent polling, do you think that a new referendum will actually be the will of the people?
Okay, so second referendum.
Yeah.
Yes. Yep.
John Lloyd from the Financial Times. On your stress on productivity, as you know, productivity tends to be lower in the service areas, and above all, usually in the public service area. Does your search for higher productivity in Scotland, which is a high proportion, I think a higher proportion than the rest of the UK, of public service, does that imply a cutting back on the public service, a reduction of the public service workforce?
Okay, so second referendum.
Sure. I've been asked the question about do I think that there will be a second referendum on this before, and actually I don't think there will. One, because it is not the policy of either of the two main parties in the House of Commons, nor is there an electoral event in which the public can vote on it before we get to the transition period. So for practical terms, I don't believe that there will be. And also I think my my view on this in terms of my wish, if you like, as somebody that voted Remain but saw 17.5 million people vote in a different way from me and having to come to an acceptance of that, even if I didn't support it. I do have to be fairly cognizant of our history here in Scotland. In terms of the independence referendum, I was very strongly and continue to be very strongly of the view that you don't just rerun it until the other side get the result that they want, which is part of the treadmill that we've been in Scotland for years. So I think it would be slightly hypocritical of me to say that just because I don't like the way a referendum went in another area, that I should just rerun it until I get the result that I want either. So, I think that if I have a big regret, I wish I had been 4% better when I was on the stage at Wembley 2 nights before the vote itself, and the result had been different. But I have to acknowledge that on this issue, I was in the minority of opinion across the United Kingdom. And if politicians make the decision that a choice that the country has to make is too big for representative democracy and it has to be passed to direct democracy, then we can't just say, well, you got it wrong and take it right back again. Because I think that absolutely destroys faith in politics. And as a Democrat, it's unacceptable to you, even if you don't like the result that the people came up with. So I don't know who it was that coined the phrase, the people have made the choice, the bastards. But I have to say that the next morning after Brexit, that was a phrase that might have been on my mind. In terms of your question, John, on productivity and doing things better, well, in my speech I mentioned 2 very, very different economic models, the German model and the American model, both of which have much higher rates of productivity than we have in Britain, but who have a wholly different way in which their economies are structured. So I don't think it's just a question of public and private policy, public and private services and operations, because you've got 2 really different models there who are miles ahead of us. I think it's about how do we do things better and how do we take some of the advantages that we have, and the example that I used was research and development, and make sure that we can bring it to market in a better way, and also how can we embrace new advances rather than be scared of it. I know that there is a huge worry, not just in this country but in lots of countries, about automation, where next for machines and robots within industry, and what does that do for people and the economic development of individuals within society. Well, we're worried about computers destroying jobs too, and I think it's how do we best use the way in which advantages are brought, and how do we, in a country which is quite often the inventor of things or the developer of things, but then falls behind later on in the utility of things, how are we able to bring that up? And like I say, we've got a commission that's looking at this question. It will come back in a couple of months' time, so I don't want to preempt some of the really good work that they've done, but I've seen some of the issues that they've been coming up with already, and we look forward to being able to play a full part in that debate. I don't think we're going to have all the answers, but I really do think it's a debate that we need to start having at a much louder volume in Scotland, and I hope the Scottish Conservatives can play a full part in that debate as we go forward.
Okay, come to you first. Yes.
Jamie Livingston from Oxfam, Scotland. Ruth, I really welcomed your comments around environmental protections. We have a new Climate Change Act coming to the Scottish Parliament later this year, and it's a critical opportunity to prevent any further global backsliding on the Paris deal. So I'm hoping your comments suggest that you will be supportive of new climate targets in Scotland that are consistent with limiting temperature rises to 1.5 degrees. But the question is around immigration, and a particular aspect, that's refugees.
Massive big right turn there, okay.
You talked about talent and attracting talent, and we have lots of talent within the refugee community that have arrived in Scotland and across the UK, but often their integration is undermined by being separated from family members. Now we have an opportunity in the Family Reunion Bill that's coming to Westminster in March to change those rules and increase the definition of what counts as family, to increasingly support people to integrate well once they are here. Given your support so far for aid, which has been influential and highly welcome, will you urge your MP colleagues to support that bill on March 16th?
Okay. Thanks, Jamie.
Thank you.
Yes?
Thank you very much, Ruth. You're working with Edinburgh University for its biggest investment yet from Bill Gates is extremely valuable. But I wonder if it's symptomatic that we're going to need a really passionate, aggressive strategy, really, for attracting much more global multinational investment into Scotland. I mean, in most sectors, it is actually multinational investment, such as the Japanese, the Chinese, and the Germans, that have really turned around productivity and competitiveness. My worry is that that confidence will be dented by losing a market of 500 million people. And by comparison, the UK with 65 million or Scotland with 5 million are not growing, and half the size of a dozen Chinese cities. My worry is that that confidence will be dented. My hope is that you will have a strategy to really go out aggressively to make Scotland the most competitive place in the whole of Europe in terms of attracting that investment, which I think would make a huge difference in a globalized world.
Okay.
Sorry, University of Edinburgh, Chris.
Thank you. So Jamie's question first about the bill before Parliament.
Cool. Well, yeah, I mean, I haven't looked at that bill in detail, but I'm happy to do so. I think you're right in saying and we need to look at the routes in which people come here. I've been quite vocal in the past about extending the pilot schemes for post-study work visas to include Scottish universities. I'm really pleased that Glasgow and Edinburgh are involved in there. As you know, I've talked a lot about the needs with immigration to have that debate and to have it in a mature fashion, which sometimes is missing, I think, because I think the temperature is a bit more heat than light when it comes to immigration. And I've talked before about the idea that if you have a immigration policy, so for example, the 100,000 net migration target per year that was devised when unemployment is running at more than 8%, when there's been a crisis in confidence about how immigration works, when you've never hit it, and you're suddenly now having unemployment at lower than 5% across the UK, lower than 4% across Scotland, is that still the right policy to have, and does it need reviewed? So I am, as you know, fond of nudging some of my UK colleagues when it comes to this issue in lots of different ways. Like I say, I would be lying if I said that I'd looked in great detail at that bill, so I can't give you a technical answer on that, but I'm happy to look at it before it comes before Parliament. In terms of Edinburgh University and the question about attractiveness and competitiveness, yes, absolutely. We need to do so much more to get as much inward investment as we can. Now, I don't think that's a particular party political statement to make, but I do think we have to be honest about where has that not worked particularly well in the past. Why is it not? Although we have had a number of flagship investments here, and that's to be supported, how do we get more of that? But also, crucially, part of the missing figure is why are we not developing our own businesses that then go on to become multinationals themselves? How do we get not just the startup, but the incubation and the growth and the ambition and the support that needs to happen to allow Scottish firms to be all around the world? I was in Switzerland last year in Davos and hosted a meeting for a number of employers in financial services mostly, but in some other areas as well, which employed more than 20 to 30,000 people across Scotland. You know, Prudential, HSBC, Aberdeen Asset Management, all these areas. Now, they are concerned about Brexit, but they also want to know about the economic plan for the United Kingdom and what is the development plan for Scotland as well. So just because this big event is happening that's causing a lot of change and churn, it does not mean that we can take our eye off the ball of sending the signals that we need to send to people that are supporting employment in this country. So I absolutely agree with your comments about that attractiveness and that competitiveness, and I think I touched on some of that in the speech, talking about tax rates and support for business as well.
Yes, come to you.
Jeremy Peat, Fellow of the Royal Society and former Director of this Institute. Ruth, I thank you for your talk, and I agree very much with the stress you placed on trying to increase the growth rate above the dismal level projected realistically by the Scottish Fiscal Commission. And I agree with all you said about getting more research and innovation implemented, rebalancing AGFE and the like, and developing infrastructure. But what worries me is this is what we've been saying for the last 20 or 30 years, as how we will get greater growth and better balanced growth. And I wonder whether you have any specific thoughts about what could be novel and changed, and in order to make progress, and how we get more of our higher education, research and development leading to productive activities. I mean, specifically, last point, what is your view on the plans for a Scottish National Investment Bank, which seems to be the latest big idea emerging from the Scottish Government?
Vice Chair, yes.
Hi, it's Jenny Stewart from KPMG here. Thank you, Ruth, for your talk, and like Jeremy, your focus on economic growth and the challenges ahead. Just picking up on the productivity point, we've also been reviewing the UK's productivity and specifically comparing region by region. And one of the we also picked up on a number of the points that you mentioned, but one of the key points that we stressed, and I'd be interested in your views, is that larger companies across the UK are just as competitive for a variety of reasons as large companies in our major competitors. The big issue is really around small and medium-sized enterprise who haven't had as much focus on, say, management and leadership skills. So that's one of the areas that if we were to try and make a significant difference in our economic potential, then that would be a key area for investment. So just wondered for your thoughts on that.
You know, and I think Jenny, you're absolutely right. I mean, we have some fantastic management schools that are attached to universities here, but not everyone wants to go for a 4-year degree or to do, you know, a 2 years master's. So when I was talking about ideas like Code Clan, which is a school for coding, if you like, why do we not have a leadership academy that can offer that same flexibility in terms of advancement and continuous professional development? And I think that does slightly lead me into the point that Jeremy was asking about. I accept the idea, Jeremy, that we've been saying for a long time that something must be done about productivity. I do accept that. What I don't accept is that we've been saying all the same things, for example, on education training, skills training. I don't think we have. I think we have seen changes in decisions that politicians make and choose to make. I think that with the very, very best of intentions, the previous Blair government wanted to hugely scale up the number of young people that went to university. The aim that they put on it was 50%, which was made with the very best of intentions. But one of the unintended consequences of that was that you already told half of all school kids at the point at which they left school that they'd already failed. And we downgraded the role of further education colleges. We've seen that yet eroded in Scotland, with so many places, over 100,000 places, being cut from the college sector in Scotland. Now, that's not something that's been. That's a decision that's been made. And one of the points that I was trying to make is that when we hear from organisations and businesses that the skills that young people are emerging with at the point at which they want to join the workforce don't match the skills that they need, then we do need to look at that again. And I also think we need to look at a wider variety of models. Jenny's a great example. I was out at KPMG, which is based in my constituency, not so very long ago, to look at their school-based, straight-from-school apprenticeship programme that they've got going on, their recruitment programme. Now, that's not something that you would expect from one of the big four. It's something new that they're trying, and I think it's very good. I'm also talking with Skills Development Scotland about the Swiss idea of having graduate apprenticeships, so people that go and are hired by a business, and while they're working for that business, go on release to a university to get a degree at the same time as they're being paid, which eliminates student debt, it eliminates a level of fees because they're covered by the company, but it gives a workforce that is being tailored to the exact needs and the exact demands that company needs. Now, that's something that exists in other countries, but actually we don't have that much of in Scotland. These are the sorts of questions that we should be asking ourselves. Now, the Swiss model may not be an answer for Scotland, but it's not even a debate that's being had in Scotland at the moment, and I think we need to bring that to the table. And I think that when you're looking at what's next for Scotland, yes, of course you've got to have budgets that are set down for the next 5 years, but you've also got to have you've also got to have a vision for the next 15 years, for the next 25 years. Where is it that we want to go, and what are the steps, crucially, that get us there? And what resources do we need to put in now to allow those steps to advance? So I do think that there's a much bigger debate that we've maybe not had in Scotland because we've been trapped in a cycle of election and election. I mean, I've been leading the Scottish Conservative Party for 6 years now, and I have fought 6 national elections and 2 referenda in that time. You know, that has not given us the space and the time to do any party, the space and the time to do the really kind of heavy policy lifting that this country is so desperately in require of if we're going to have an ambitious vision for what we look like rather than just put a sticking plaster on it and hope we can muddle through. If we want to really change things, if we want to, then we really have to examine some of the cultural shibboleths that we just all live with. You know, these sort of ideas that as if we can't challenge it. Well, maybe we sometimes have to ask those unaskable questions. And we may not like the answers, but it's something that we as a country need to be much better at doing. And it's incumbent on people like myself and the First Minister and others to have the self-confidence to put ideas out there that could be quite easily shot down. But to try and gather some form of consensus of ways in which we can change and we can improve this country. Because that's what we all want. We have different ideas about how we go about it, but fundamentally that's what all policy leaders want, is to have a better future for the country. And I think that it's within our grasp, but we have to be a bit braver about it, and I think we probably have failed in the recent years on that.
Yes, in the middle and then on the left.
Thanks. Mark McEwen, Turk and Connell. Thanks, Ruth, for your comments this evening. You mentioned early on in your talk the need for the Scottish Government and the UK Government to work together on Brexit more closely. When the First Minister was here earlier in the month, she mentioned the Joint Ministerial Committee and probably, as expected, wasn't terribly warm about it. What mechanisms would you put in place to make sure that the two did work together to reach a common goal?
Okay. Thanks.
Laura Dunlop, Faculty of Advocates. My question is actually quite similar in theme. Under the withdrawal bill as it currently stands, neither the Scottish Parliament nor the Scottish Government would be allowed to touch the EU-derived regulatory systems in relation to agriculture, fisheries or the environment without the permission of Westminster. Is it simply a series of unfortunate events that led to the promised amendments not being brought forward during all the time the bill was in the Commons?
Actually, it was an issue of complexity, because there's no lack of political will to bring forward a change to Clause 11 that was there. You know, we want to see it brought forward, the SNP want to see it brought forward, others do too. But it's not enough to just write down words on a bit of paper. That actually, if it's passed, becomes the law and the frameworks that are there. And to kind of catch people up with what we're talking about, there is an agreement that lots of things that are currently set at a framework at a European level that's going to come back to the United Kingdom should absolutely be passed straight to Scotland. And I would envisage things like forestry, things like water quality, things like housing and insulation, things like land use. All of these things will come back automatically, I would expect. There are some areas where it's in the interest of everybody, and this is acknowledged by the SNP, to have what's called a joint framework. So that's where all of the devolved administrations and the UK government set up a framework that works across the whole of the United Kingdom. So the easiest example is food labelling. You don't want to sell something to Tesco and then Tesco have to have like 4 different levels of food labelling to send it to shops in the 4 different parts of the United Kingdom. So that's in everybody's joint interest that we have that right. Now the problem is we have to decide before we write it down in the legislation, before it gets passed in the Commons, what that framework looks like. So one, what does it consist of? How is it erected? If there's a dispute between people in that, how is that dispute resolved? What is the backstop for dispute resolution? All of these things. So how can it be that people are engaged in that decision-making process of the joint framework without one side or the other imposing themselves upon the other? That's quite complicated, and we've never done it before because we've never left the European Union before or left any organisation wherein laws and policy areas are held at that framework level. So that's why it's taken longer, and I'm as frustrated as anybody, and I've put my frustrations on record, but it is something that we have to get right. So there's no conspiracy about why it's not been written down yet. It's just we have to make sure we get all of these areas areas right. And I think that comes back to the mechanics that Mark was talking about, is we've got to have a way in which all of the different parts of the United Kingdom, in areas where it's clearly in everybody's interest, and there's acknowledgement that it's in everybody's interest, to maximise the benefit we have from being part of a single internal UK market, to be able to make those collective decisions. I think agriculture is an interesting one. I think that it's going to be one of those ones where it's quite difficult in the first instance, because there are different agricultural priorities in the different parts of the United Kingdom. But I think that at the moment, you've got a system wherein there is a common framework that's set at European level, and all of the devolved administrations administer that framework. Well, actually, if there's agreement about a common framework at a UK level, then the devolved administrations will still administer within that framework. So I don't think it's beyond the wit of man to get an answer, but that doesn't mean that there's not going to be, quite rightly, some hard-fought questions about what that looks like as we go forward.
Was that?
Well, in terms of Mark's question about the mechanics of it, part of that is sorting out what these joint frameworks look like, and I agree that the joint ministerial committees are not the best decision-making bodies in the world. I don't think that that's the way in which, nor should it be politicians making decisions all the time anyway. You need to have frameworks that exist so decisions can be made with the politics taken out of them when it comes to pragmatic decisions for individual areas and individual disciplines. So that's part of the work that's going on right now in the argument that you're seeing of what clausalism, which everyone agrees will be taken out and rewritten, and what it's rewritten and what that looks like.
Thanks, Mark. Yes, at the back, and at the very back. Thank you.
David Gow from Skeptical.Scot. And I'd like to go back to your comments about growth and the dismal Scottish prospects. And aren't they actually going to be made worse by Brexit itself? We read overnight about the latest report and assessment done for the Department for Exiting the EU, which says on the 3 scenarios are likely to be on offer effectively from the EU 27, i.e., staying in the or joining the EEA, having a comprehensive free trade agreement, or actually no deal, i.e., WTO type arrangements. The negative impact on growth is between 2 and 8% over the next 15 years. So presumably, if the Scottish economy is already weaker, it will be even more heavily impacted. So do you think these forecasts are kosher, or do you think they're like Steve Baker, the Minister for Brexit, suggested at the Commons this afternoon, are rubbish, which seems unlikely since they were drawn up by the Cabinet Office, apparently. And how do you think they should be overcome?
Okay, thanks, David. And the very, very back.
Thank you. Morag Wallace. I represent no organisation and put myself down as a floating voter.
Still, your question's still more than welcome.
So I'm building on some of the questions that have been asked earlier, and really in relation to fisheries as an example, which is an devolved area to Scotland, and being it reported that what is likely to happen or potentially might happen is that we end up with something similar to what is already the common fisheries policy. And I think, if anything, the referendum was about UK citizens looking for control over various policy areas. And the Scottish fishermen, I think, were looking for control over fisheries policies that would meet the requirements of Scotland. And it would appear that they're going to get nothing. They potentially could have it negotiated away as part of a bigger deal if we end up with a common fisheries policy. Or alternatively, it arrives back in Westminster, not necessarily to be devolved to Scottish Parliament. So I would just like some information on the basis that people voted certain ways thinking that they were going to get certain outcomes, what the impact might well be, if any of those potential scenarios go forward, bearing in mind that we have a bit of a sensitive situation just in terms of Scotland's position in the United Kingdom.
Okay, thank you.
Just as it happens, Morag, the last meeting in my office before we left to come here this evening was Bertie Armstrong from the Scottish Fishermen's Federation. So we're in very close contact, not just with them, but with the Whitefish Fleet, with the pelagic stock and with the Nephrops fishermen as well. And we understand that they're very keen to ensure that during this transition period, we see this movement from the UK being part of the common fisheries policy, where even the most ardent Remainer is a Brexiteer when it comes to fishing, and moving to a situation where we're classed as an independent coastal state. That is, we have a seat round the table independently, as you see with other countries that are non-EU. Now, that's something that we are pursuing with the UK government, and it has a degree of support from the Secretary of State. And it's certainly, I think, one of the issues that would be very welcome in demonstrating during the transition that we are actually transitioning to something and may allay some of the fears of people who are devoted Brexiteers, unlike myself. I think in terms of what you're talking about in the current model, at the moment, as I was explaining before, Scotland administers a policy framework that is held at a European level. So yes, fisheries is devolved, but it's only devolved within what the rules are and how they're set. Now, as fisheries changes and come back, of course we're going to have negotiations with the EU, with the Icelandic fishermen, with people from the Faroe Islands, with Norway, etc. We will still be able to change and to have input ourselves, and that's why all of the Fishermen's Federation are united in wanting to ensure that the UK is this independent coastal state. And I certainly want to see that we move to that in a faster way than a slower one. Not least because there are negotiations coming up where we want to have a seat at the table and not have our waters carved up without us being there. So I think that's what I can say on that. In terms of the forecast that you talked about, yeah, I mean, I think economic forecasting is interesting as far as they go. I think that what is difficult about the forecast that were released this morning is that none of the three options that were put forward are actually the option which is being proposed by the UK government. They're all different options. But I mean, I'm not going to sit here and pretend that I haven't spent at least the last 5 years of my life arguing that large constitutional change will have an economic impact against people, whether it's on independence or whether it's on Brexit, who've shouted me into my face that large constitutional change will have no economic impact and everything will be fine, thank you very much. In terms of those assessments that came out this morning, it does not surprise me, even though I'm not an economist, that the larger the constitutional change, i.e. going to WTO rules, the bigger the impact would be. That doesn't seem to me to be surprising at all. However, I think when you got to the way you opened your question about Scotland's future growth prospects, we still have that question, that Fraser-Valander question that I asked. With any Brexit uncertainty affecting the UK as well, it's hard to argue that Scotland's relatively weaker performance can be explained by the outcome of the EU referendum. Why is it that the UK is growing at more than 2% per year? We're growing at less than 1% per year and will do for the next 5 years. Why is it we've been downgraded to the longest period of low growth for 6 decades? That can't be explained by something that's happening elsewhere in the United Kingdom that isn't having that same effect. So I'm not arguing that there will be no impact from Brexit. I've never argued that. That's partly why I was on the side of the Remain. But what we have to do is also look at what we can do ourselves of why this differential exists. What is it that we're not doing right? What can we improve upon? How can we have a brighter future? And how can we prove the economic forecasters wrong? Because we can't say that we believe one set of economic forecasts but not the other. So you can't be a die-hard Remainer nationalist and say that the Fraser-Valander and the Growth Commission forecasts that they talk about Scottish low growth is wrong, but the UK assessments that are put out today are right. Nor can you be a mad Brexiteer and say that we're going to dismiss the assessments that came out this morning, but we're going to hold up the Scottish fiscal forecasts. So I think We know that forecasting is difficult. We know that it's very seldom correct. We know that, if you look at the OBR last year, they were out by 3%, so I don't know how they think they can get it right for 15 years from now when they can't get it right from a year from now. But that doesn't mean they're valueless. But I do think when we're looking at Scotland's economic future, yes, of course, we have to examine Brexit and exploit those opportunities that are there, mitigate the dangers that we see. But we also have to look beyond that, because Brexit is not the only story, and low growth existed before Brexit happened.
Yes.
Thank you for your talk, Ruth. You made the observation that increased tax payment will start at 33,000, which may affect quite a lot of people in this room. If then the tax becomes more punitive and the bans are changed again, to what extent do you think there will be an income drain by people moving out of Scotland?
Well, I mean, I think there's a lot of people that have heard anecdotal evidence about that. I think what is interesting is that the scenarios that were put forward by the Scottish Government when they were looking at possible different tax variations, none of them really accounted for behavioural change, so that wasn't factored in. And I do think that there is a very recent history that we've seen in this country of the law of unintended consequences when it comes to changes in taxation. And the example that I would give and I would point to is the change from stamp duty to land and buildings transaction tax, LBTT, where there was a £60 million gap between projected receipts and the behavioural change, which then resulted in those receipts being a lot lower. So that's one of the reasons that I'm talking not just about what that means in pounds and pence for the individual, but what trajectory does that set the country on, which is the term that I was using. Sorry, John, I jumped in and answered one question at a time, and I know you wanted to do them in bunches, so I'll let you get back to cheering. Sorry.
Thanks.
Yeah.
And right behind, gentleman in this next row, thanks.
Steve Brusati, University of Edinburgh and Young Academy. So thank you very much, Ruth. Very interesting talk. Now, you're a Remainer, but your party, of course, has brought us the referendum and is now tasked with delivering Brexit. And every day we're reading in the newspapers about the big divides in the party. So do you have confidence in the Prime Minister to keep the party together and to deliver Brexit? And if so, why is that? And if not, what would you have to say? And thank you.
Well, for all the journalists in the room, just let me check that this microphone is on. Yes, of course, I have full confidence in our Prime Minister. But I don't doubt that she's got a tough job. I really don't. And this is something that has never been done before. It is incredibly difficult, complex, unravelling of 40 years worth of shared regulatory regimes and history that's going to go on. I think that one of the issues that we have is that because Brexit or not Brexit wasn't defined by any government, because the parties themselves didn't advocate for one side or the other. There was disputes within parties, within my own party, within the Labour Party, and others. What Brexit looked like wasn't really defined beforehand. And also, it's not entirely in the United Kingdom's gift. This is a negotiation, and it's going to be brought forward. But I do think if you look, even in Scotland, at some of the recent polling that's been done and opinion searching, John Curtis's poll from 2 weeks ago, despite the fact that Scotland voted to remain, you ask questions within that of what should happen. There was nearly 2/3 support for changes to immigration rules for EU nationals. There wanted, popular support in Scotland was for an idea that immigration would change and it wouldn't be free movement of people afterwards. Now, that quite surprised me, actually, that was quite as high, because we hear so much about being part of the single market. And of course, the single market is not just about goods and services, it's also about people. So I do think that it is very complex. But I also think that if we don't get distracted by the white noise of every newspaper headline every single day, you'll see that quite a lot has already been achieved. So we've already got the divorce bill, which people said we'd never find a settlement on. We've already got protections for EU nationals living in the UK and for Brits that are living abroad, and that was proposed to be a very thorny issue. We're now moving to what the trade deal looks like. And when you're the 5th biggest economy in the world, you're not sitting at the table without any cards. That's not to say that I'm running around saying that they'll give us everything that we want, because negotiations don't work that way. But there is something that's in our interests to make sure, and it's in the EU 27's interests as well, to make sure that we can progress, and we can progress in a way that is beneficial to all concerned, or at least least harmful to all concerned. And I think that one of the things that we haven't perhaps examined is the difference between phase 1 and phase 2 of the negotiations. Now, phase 1 of the negotiations, it was pretty easy for Michel Barnier to have a consensus of the EU 27 standing behind him. When it's Brexit bills and transition periods, get a transition period and get the highest bill that you can out of the UK. That's something that can unite everyone in the EU 27. Actually, when it comes to trade deals, tariffs, non-tariff barriers, etc., particularly when it comes to sectors, there is diverging and sometimes conflicting wishes from some of the member states. And my belief is that actually as this goes forward, you'll see more conflict within the EU than we've seen, because they've been pretty united up until now. And you will be able to see some differentiation, and that actually some of the decisions that are made will move out of the Commission and will move more into the heads of state. But do I think there'll be a deal? Yes, I think there will. I don't believe and don't foresee that there'll be some sort of falling out hard Brexit. I also think that there is a consensus that is forming, and you even heard Liam Fox this morning talking about the idea that there's not the numbers in the House for a hard regulatory change, that there will have to be regulatory alignment. You saw with the question over the border position in Northern Ireland and Ireland, the idea that it would have to be regulatory alignment, and then the default position, if there couldn't be a bespoke deal, that would then go and attach itself to the rest of the UK as well, because we don't want any border in the North Sea. So for a lot of people run around talking about a hard Tory Brexit, I actually think this will be a much softer Brexit than some people fear.
Thanks, Steve. Yes? And do we have another question? Okay, I'll come to you next, thanks.
Dick Philbrick from a company called Clansman Dynamics in East Kilbride. We're actually one of the rare SMEs, and we export machines to 45 countries around the world. Just make a small point and then a quick question. My point is that our growth is impacted because we can't find engineers and commercial people who speak a foreign language. A huge problem for us. And if you make something, you've got more or less got a duty to export it. And my question is, what is Liam Fox, who you've just mentioned, up to, and has he achieved anything in the last 18 months?
Before, can I just say the Law Society are entirely neutral on these matters, and if I appear to be shaking or nodding my head at any point, I'm neither shaking nor nodding my head, okay? So...
My name's Michael Russell from my own consultancy business. Outside the sort of rarefied academic atmosphere of these type of events, I often wonder what the people in the street think about what's going on. And I wonder, you must meet many people out in your constituency, on the stump as it were. Amongst the people I say the man on the Clapham omnibus, but the woman on the Edinburgh tram, what are they thinking nearly 18 months on from the referendum? Are they weary? Are they fed up with the whole thing? Did they ever really get excited about it? Are they more animated now than they were with what's going on? I just wonder what the mood of the people is as the events have become so protracted and rather turgid.
Yeah. I think what you're seeing in the sphere of debate is you see people that are at who believe very strongly on one side or the other are taking a more entrenched position, and I think that's slightly distorting the debate, because my overwhelming sense of what the average punter in the street thinks, and this is across both Remainer and Leaver lines, is a sense of just bloody get on with it. A sense of, can we not just get this done now, and sort of what's next? And I think that there perhaps isn't an understanding of what the different phases are to this, and I think there would probably be quite a lot of dismay at the idea that Brexit is going to take a lot of years. This is going to be on your television news for a very, very long time, and that it doesn't stop, in March of next year, and it doesn't stop even a couple of years after that, because it's rather like devolution, I think, is going to be a process, not an event. So my overwhelming belief is and certainly what's conveyed to me is, can you just bloody get on with it, please? And that does slightly lead me on to Phil, to your question. Yes, I do think there is a question about our language training in this country. In terms of how we marry that with our choices in schools, quite often you'll find in the way in which you can choose exams and training is that the science, math, engineering subjects are actually in conflict with the arts and humanities, and sometimes you need to have them together to be able to get the full package. Your point about Liam Fox, and in terms of being able to seek to do deals around the world, of course, there is a restriction in what can happen while we're still a member of the EU. So at the moment, we are prohibited as a nation by the EU from signing any trade deals. And trade deals take a long time, so the preparatory work for the point at which we are allowed to sign trade deals is what's going on right now. And hopefully that's one of the things that the transition period will allow us to do, is to be able to start on that work. There's also been the hard and technical and presumably quite turgid work of translating the trade deals that we have as part of the EU with other external nations and incorporating them and making sure we have agreement that these can continue. And that's a process that can be quite laborious, but is certainly important. So,
I'm going to rule out your "is Liam Fox rubbish" question. Okay, I don't think it would be fair to Ruth to answer that question. Okay, so anyone else? Yes, at the back.
Hello, Ian MacDonald, just a private member. I have a question about two sectors that haven't been discussed much tonight. One is the tourism sector in Scotland, and the other is the food and drink sector. Both of those are famously dependent on labour from Europe. And as we go around and meet people and talk to them, there's worries on both the employer's side and on the employee's side. Are they right to be as worried as they are? Are the things going to be done that will look after those interests? It certainly worries me.
Okay, thank you. And yes, over. Right, thanks.
Thank you. Married Leslie, Chatham House. The EU withdrawal bill's in the House of Lords at the moment, and a cross-party committee of the Lords has described it as constitutionally deeply flawed. They were pointing to, for instance, the so-called Henry VIII powers for the executive. They were pointing to a transfer of powers from the courts into a vacuum that could only be resolved by the executive. They were worried about the devolution clause 11 powers, which you've already touched on helpfully. You described yourself as a Democrat, and I very much respect that. I wondered what changes you hoped to see in the bill before it returns to the Commons.
From the Democratic House of Lords?
From the House of Lords.
Yes, I mean, that's why we have a revising chamber, is to make sure that legislation is examined and is tested and is improved before it goes back. And that's why we have the stages that we have. I think sometimes, actually, in Scotland, we suffer from not doing enough pre-legislative scrutiny. And that's why we sometimes don't have, or sometimes we need to do a little bit more post-legislative scrutiny. So the area which I've been most involved with, as you would imagine, has been Clause 11, and was working through the recess with others and with colleagues within the government on how that can better reflect what needs to happen to allow these common frameworks to be advanced and for the withdrawal bill to pass, because I don't think it's in anyone's interests for us, and I think this is what people need to keep in mind. This is about making sure that as we leave the European Union, we don't have a hole in the legal framework of the United Kingdom or of in Scotland. So it's in many ways about protecting and shoring up what currently exists because we're a member of the EU as we leave it, so we don't leave big gaps in the framework. But do I think that it's a perfect bill? No, of course I don't, and that's why I've been working with others in order to try and improve it. And I think that's why having this pre-legislative scrutiny that we have through the UK Parliament is a good thing. Ian, in terms of the questions that you raised regarding tourism and food and drink in Scotland, you're right, they're absolutely vital sectors in Scotland. They're also quite important sectors in other parts of the United Kingdom as well, and I don't think a hotelier in Golspie as any sort of different need than a hotelier in Newcastle or a soft fruit farmer in Perthshire from one in Hertfordshire. And that's why, in terms of sectoral issues, and particularly regarding labour, you see the United Kingdom government looking at things like seasonal workers' visas, which hopefully will be able to reassure people in those sectors where they particularly have high volumes of people at some point in the year, but not at other points of the year, and that is so crucial for how they move forward.
Well, thanks very much, everyone. We've come to the end of our question and answer session. Thanks very much for your questions, which were all very detailed, and I hope that Ruth was able to give you as detailed answers. So thanks very much.
Jane Francis Kelly promised you at the beginning that I would be brief in my in my thanks to Ruth, so I feel obliged to preface that so that there is no relationship between the extent of our gratitude and the length of time I spend expressing it. I want to express our thanks in two ways. First, on behalf of the David Hume Institute, for entering so thoughtfully into the territory that we have asked speakers to explore, to pitch forward beyond Brexit into the range of challenges that will face us, irrespective of the details of the outcome of the Brexit solutions. And second, on behalf of all of us, to thank you, Ruth, for the stimulating and thorough way in which you've done that. It's a measure of my thanks that I'm having enormous difficulty from refraining from commenting on any of the things that you said, and I hope that sense of suppressed thought of stimulation is something that everybody in the room shares, and that we can carry forward from the room out into the drinks reception when people have a chance to talk to each other and to you. So thank you very much for setting everybody's minds abuzz in the way that I'm sure you have, and thank you for giving so much thought to the talk you've given us this evening.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Ruth. Just, I'm here to say a few words on behalf of the RSE Young Academy. I promise that you will have a glass of wine in your hand at 7:35, so just give me a few minutes. Thank you again. From our point of view, we're very proud and happy to support these events. And a few words about the RSE Young Academy. I think the first thing to say is that we are now open to new members. This only happens once every 2 years, and there's still 2 weeks of application ahead of you. So if you know of anybody, and I'm talking about academics as well as industry people and public service sector workers and so on, that might want to join us and be involved in some of the work that we do here, then please look online. And don't let the name RSE Young Academy put you off, because it's a fairly misleading term. I know what you're thinking, you're looking at me, and surely he's not in the Young Academy. I think the RSE Middle-Aged Academy of Scotland wasn't quite so snappy. So I just want to do a couple of things about what we do. A couple of weeks ago, one of my colleagues, NASA, talks about the Brexit report that we published a few months ago. I want to talk about something that the Arts and Humanities group at the Young Academy have done, which is this Silent Histories project, which was an online video project that records the experiences of refugees in Scotland, and it was made with the help of school children, which looks at refugees from Syria and from Iraq who have come to settle in Scotland. But it also puts their experiences in the context of other events that have happened in history where people have fled persecution and dangerous countries. And I'm very proud of that history that Scotland has of welcoming people who are fleeing persecution. And if you look online, you will see this film and a number of educational resources available to schools and targeted particularly 8 to 11-year-olds. I should also say that we're also encouraging and targeting refugees to become members of the Young Academy and some of our at-risk academics from around the world, because that can only benefit the work that we do here and the diversity of our membership. The next film project that we've got going is something that we're working with the Scotland Futures Forum at the Scottish Parliament on, which is part of their 2030 project. So this is about future gazing and asking ourselves what kind of country do we want in 2030, thinking about some big themes like technology, education, well-being, and energy and environment. And I'm going to corner Ruth, hopefully with a drink in her hand, so she's more amenable, to try and get her support and get her involved in the project as well, because I hope this will be a cross-party as well as sort of cross-sector film that can really showcase some of the visions and ideas of people from across Scotland. What do we want this great nation to be like in 2030? That's enough from me, I think. Thank you again for coming tonight, and please enjoy your drinks outside. Everybody else is free.